You're watching Breakthrough News.
I'm Charlotte thun-hohenstein and you're watching Breakthrough News on BTR Today. On today's show, we're talking about the future of journalism with the rise of drones. Are the benefits that drones bring worth it? Joining us to discuss this is Matthew Schroyer, founder and president of dronejournalism.org, and Mickey Osterreicher, General Counsel to the National Press Photographers Association and award-winning photojournalist. So we've actually talked on this show about drones before and how they're changing our world here in the US. And one of the big things that came up that clearly makes a lot of people very uncomfortable is this issue of privacy and surveillance, and the worry that drones are too powerful on these fronts to be part of our lives at home. And yet, of course, it's exactly this power that drones have to record and observe things that makes them so exciting to journalists. So hopefully today, focusing specifically on journalism, we can get to the bottom of this. Mickey, what is it that's so exciting to you? Because you're a photojournalist. So what is it that's so exciting to you about drones? Because one of the things that came up in our previous discussions was this idea that actually the technology that drones are using is not itself new. It's just somehow the combination of technologies that makes them extra powerful.
Well, it's not only the combination of that, but it's also the fact that the price of them have been coming down so that they're affordable for everyone. And they're certainly in a time of economic constraints that there are many news organizations that would like to consider using these rather than having to pay for a Bell Jet Ranger, which operates at a much higher cost. But going back to what you said at the beginning in terms of privacy concerns, I mean, this is not the first time in the history of the world that people have been concerned about privacy. At the turn of the last century, actually back in the late 1800s, when people used to have to sit in a chair with a neck brace for exposures of between 4 and 5 minutes to have their photographs taken. When the advent of the Brownie camera, which came out in about 1890, first occurred, there were all kinds of privacy concerns about the fact that there were going to now be people running around in the streets, taking pictures of people in doing various things, invading upon their privacy. And two Harvard students wrote about this. They wrote about the right to privacy. One of them went on to become a Supreme Court justice, Justice Brandeis. And the point is that the law eventually caught up to the technology, just as it does with all technologies as they happen. So, as people were using very long telephoto lenses and worried about privacy, I think so too we will eventually reach an equilibrium where this new technology is able to be used, and there will be the usual safeguards against people's privacy being protected.
Okay, so Matthew, what sort of drones are we actually talking about right now in terms of journalism? Because certainly the specifics of the technology is very important, as Mickey was just mentioning with that progress. But I mean, there's obviously a huge difference between the ginormous airplane-sized drones that the military uses and then literally styrofoam toy planes that now are also sometimes being considered drones, even in law cases. So when it comes to journalism, what sort of drones are we talking about?
Right, there's a huge variety of drones that might be of interest. They come to journalists. They come in all shapes and sizes, from anything that's as small as a dinner plate, basically, to vehicles that can carry heavy, high definition cameras with heavy lenses. But in general, journalists are interested in drones that would fit into a category of small unmanned aircraft systems in the United States, at least. So we're talking about things that are under 55 pounds, frequently much less than 55 pounds. Many of these vehicles might bear similarities to helicopters. We call these multi-rotors. So they have the ability to hover in one spot or sweep along a path. There was a really interesting video done by the Telegraph of flooding in the United Kingdom recently that kind of showed off the ability of the drone to act in this challenging environment, this challenging flooded environment, and made these sweeping shots and flying inches above the water to show what the flooding had done in the UK, sometimes getting up really close with flooded vehicles and generally just illustrating a quality of video or a quality of experience in immersiveness that you hadn't really had before, except for perhaps in a controlled environment like a motion picture studio. That is the kind of capability that a lot of journalists are looking for. Like you said, essentially a placement for a news helicopter that costs a lot less. It's also a lot less dangerous because it doesn't weigh 2,000 pounds, and generally do not fly as high as those helicopters. When you're talking about what you want to accomplish as a journalist, generally you want to stay under 400 feet to get the best footage or images, because you want to get that close to the subject. Much less common at this point, but potentially something that might be used in the future are tiny airplanes, not helicopters necessarily, but things that look more like airplanes. And the purpose of those would be to map out environments. So this isn't something that's done a lot currently in journalism, but there's a lot of data that you can obtain if you can map out an area. So, such as the flooding, as I mentioned in the UK. So that might be useful for citizens on the ground to know if they can get out of town safely, what resources are underwater, what's safe, and even go beyond that into kind of environmental journalism to map out effects on the environment. So those are some options that are on the horizon, and the technology is developing pretty rapidly, and the price point's coming down, and the ease of use is coming down as well, enabling a lot of journalists to develop these systems.
Mickey, do you look at these examples that Matthew just cited and think that they do absolutely represent a crucial new threshold in terms of the future of journalism? Are there any other fields of journalism that you think drones are going to be particularly useful for?
I think, not to be facetious, the sky's the limit, really. I think there will be more and more uses found for these, certainly weather reports. I mean, now we're so used to people being out in the field, standing out there with their rulers, sticking them in snow, saying, look how much snow is fallen. I think eventually we might be able to get some quick aerial views to add to a news broadcast in terms of the weather segment. Sports, certainly we just saw them being used for the Olympics in Sochi. So I really think that the possibilities of the uses are endless.
What about how this changes the role of the journalist itself? Because of course with this new technology comes all these new skills that are required to pilot a drone. How do you see that playing out, Matthew? And is there even a danger in these new skills perhaps detracting from the existing skills that you need to be a journalist? What about that element of it?
Yeah. This is a concern of journalists everywhere, and specifically of journalism schools that that are tasked with putting out journalists with kind of the up-to-date skill set. And it just kind of adds on to the expectation. I think some would argue that you can adjust the curriculum to integrate these new skills, but at no point do I think that the underlying importance of the journalist distracts from the mission, because when you approach a situation, you are approaching it as a journalist first and foremost. So you're looking for either a perspective that you can't get on the ground, or potentially revealing some information that hadn't been released before, maybe even verifying government information. That might mean images and video, or it might mean geospatial data and chemical sensing and these kinds of advanced things. But you still need to be a journalist to understand the news value in what you're getting from the drones, and to be able to interpret that to normal people. So I mean, when you talk about with all the data you can obtain with a drone, it sounds a lot like science, and in some ways that might be getting into some of the habits that scientists do, but at the end of the day your goal is to inform the public and get it out there and have people understand the importance of what you've observed in the field.
Yeah, I think it's just another tool. It's nothing changes the fact that photojournalists still have to do the basic storytelling, and just as a better camera or a newer camera or an iPhone is not going to change whether or make somebody a better journalist, but it will give them another tool, another option. Just in terms of drawing analogies, it's been clearly seen that you can't just fight a war from the air. That eventually, in order to win a war, you have to have troops on the ground. And I think in order to tell a story, you've got to have people on the ground. Yeah, it'd be nice to have an aerial view to throw into the story, obviously to give people an overview, to help them understand relationships better, to maybe see an angle that they normally wouldn't see from the ground. But the story's going to be told on the ground. It's not going to be completely told from the air.
So you can't ultimately get rid of that human behind the drone that's still going to be choosing the perspective and what makes the footage that they get meaningful.
Well, I would hope not.
I hope not too. Well, we'll be right back in a moment after this quick excerpt from the latest episode of Serious Business on BTR featuring Exocomet. We're back with our discussion on the work of drone journalism. Now, there's been a bunch of confusion, right, with recent drone cases involving civilian drone use. Of course, the FAA put a ban on commercial drone use since 2007, but we're seeing really lawmakers grappling with this situation and with these different levels of technology. Mickey, can you elaborate on that?
Sure. There's a recent case, it only happened a few weeks ago, where a journalist who worked for a television station in Connecticut was on his day off and flew his own personal drone over the scene of a fatal accident. The police were very concerned. They eventually figured out who was flying it. They asked him to stop. They asked the FAA to investigate, and they reported the incident to his employer, who unfortunately suspended him for a week. So it's my understanding that that photographer has now filed suit against the police, and we'll see how that sorts itself out. I also understand that in the only other case where I believe the FAA was seeking to level their $10,000 fine in Virginia for somebody flying over the university there, I think we're also seeing some pushback there where they're basically claiming that the FAA has been mandated to come up with these regulations, but they're not yet in place. So for the FAA to be articulating the fact that no commercial use of drones, including for news gathering, is prohibited, I think we're going to start to see some pushback on that level of, well, you guys really need to show us where that is other than you stating without any actual rulemaking in place where those rules are.
Matthew, do you think that really strict distinction between commercial use and individual use is wise or perhaps misplaced? Because I'm thinking for journalism, which as a field is, of course, in flux, and increasingly journalistic companies are turning to freelancers to get their content. So how do you even enforce this line, which seems to be increasingly blurred?
It is very frustrating, and it's a huge frustration for journalists in the United States who have to deal with this. And it's like you said, it's kind of muddy. It's not clear. The lines are blurred. The case in Connecticut also brings up a First Amendment issue. I mean, it's been long held that in the public and things that are in public view, you have a right to photograph in accordance with your First Amendment rights. And so this journalist in Connecticut, for example, was not on the clock working for this television news station, but you could argue still working in the capacity of a journalist. But even if he wasn't a journalist at the time, he'd still have the right to photograph what he could see. By all accounts, his drone was flying behind the police lines, about 150 feet away from the accident, then another 150 feet up, far away with a camera that had really no ability to focus on the scene or see inside the car and see the person's body inside the car, which the police claimed was their big concern about privacy. But that totally ignored the other journalists who were right at the scene with cameras that focused well inside of the vehicle. But those journalists weren't questioned by police, and they weren't pursued in the manner that Mr. Pedro Rivera was. And that was what we said as much on our statement about Mr. Pedro Rivera, is that it was an unfair standard to apply to a person using this tool. I mean, they are all tools to be used to record things happening in public, and we see no reason to make a distinction between Rivera's tool, at least based on the images and the data that he's given us, and all the other journalists operating in the area, but then at the end of the day, he was the one that was pursued. So this is the kind of stuff that we have to deal with on a daily basis here in the United States, on a local level with police, and then on a state level with states like Texas, which has a really strict, in my opinion, law that even if you are flying one of these vehicles over public land and taking photos of things happening on public land, unless you obtain permission from the persons or whoever owns the property that's there in that photo, you could be fined perhaps $10,000 for things that, if you were on the ground taking a photo, would not be an issue. And so, I mean, that's on the state level. And then, as Mickey said, there's frustration on the federal level, and that there's no real regulation at this point. The FAA, being a federal agency that makes rules, has to follow a certain protocol to be able to make rules that are recognized in courts. That involves coming out with a draft of the rules, having a public comment period, and then publishing the final rules in the register. And the FAA hasn't done that. So in the meantime, they say, our rule right now is that you can't fly for profit. As you mentioned, the goal of journalism, may not be for profit. There's a lot of not-for-profit newsrooms. There's people who do this as a hobby. When I go out, and for instance, when I went up to a town that was wrecked by a tornado in November and flew around, I didn't do it for profit. I didn't do it for any kind of compensation for a news station or for anyone else. So, I mean, these are difficult questions for journalists in the United States, and fortunately we have members in Canada and Australia and Europe and the UK that don't have to deal with this right now, and I think we need to look to those countries for examples of how to conduct the airspace in the United States.
Mickey, you mentioned earlier previous difficulties, I guess, in society and lawmakers dealing with earlier technologies and how it is this ongoing process. Given that it is relatively new, this type of technology with drones, is it sort of to be expected to a certain extent that there will be disproportionate reactions and that this is all part of the process in working it out, and that maybe in a couple of years the law will find that balance? Are you hopeful on that account?
Absolutely. Unfortunately, we've become this age of instant gratification where, if you type something in on the computer, you can pretty much find out the answer to any question that you might have. And it's the same thing here. As this technology advances, back in the 1800s, they were a little bit more patient for the law to develop. I have a feeling that patience may be tested here. But as Matthew was saying, the Congress has been mandated to do their rules making according to the procedures that he laid out, and they keep delaying that. I mean, they're supposed to have these rules in place by 2015, but at the rate they're going, that's probably not likely to happen. In the meantime, there are all these state legislatures that are getting into the act. First of all, there's a federal preemption. They can make whatever rules they want, but eventually when the FAA rules come out, they're the ones that are going to govern. But we're seeing these, again, feel-good laws. I mean, we've seen them with anti-paparazzi statutes that states have tried to develop. Again, there's that concern that these drones are going to be used for that type of invasive photography. One of the things that we're disappointed about, and I advocate, for the right to photograph and record on the ground all the time. It's an issue I deal with journalists and citizens and police. And we would really very much like to see a news gathering exception that's found in many laws, and it's not lumped into commercial use. We think that that's inappropriate to include news gathering as part of a broad commercial use ban. But unfortunately, I mean, in this respect, in terms of First Amendment law, the First Amendment's not absolute. It's subject to reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions, and safety would by and large be considered a reasonable factor. So, since the FAA's basic mandate is safety, and they've only been recently tasked with including the privacy issue because it's come up, and that's only happened through one of the Congress basically saying to them in an authorization act that provides money to the Department of Transportation, you need to address the privacy concerns as well. So I think even if they just had to address the safety issues, they'd have a hard enough time. But then trying to address the privacy issues, it's probably going to become a matter of case law. They're going to have to get things in place. People are going to start operating these things. I mean, not start, they are already. And the reality is that the FAA, with cuts, barely have enough inspectors to look after actual airplane crashes and airplane safety. So for them to be investigating the probably hundreds, if not thousands of times that drones are being used throughout the country for various commercial purposes, whether it's for real estate, whether it's for journalism, whether it's for all sorts of things, they are never going to be able to keep up with keeping track of all of these uses. And only the most egregious uses will get their attention. And what I'm seeing, at least, is, and no news organization, no large news organization wants to become the test case for that. Individuals seem to be more likely to try it. I certainly don't think in Connecticut that the photographer there ever thought that what happened to him was going to happen to him. He thought he was flying it for his own use. He wasn't violating any station policy and he was on his own time, and yet now he's found himself in the middle of this large controversy. So these are things that are just all going to have to sort themselves out as we move along, as with most case law.
Well, we're going to have to finish up soon. I'd like to just give Matthew the last word about humanitarian uses of drones. You mentioned your own use with surveying, I guess, disaster damage. But I mean, for example, there's the Sentinel project, which is hoping to use drones not only to predict, but then to prevent human atrocities abroad. Drones have been already used in Eastern Europe and Turkey during protests to document police atrocities. What about that whole element of it, which we, of course, really don't have to even think about in terms of atrocities here in the US, but what about that potential for drones abroad?
Yeah, there's a hope that with these unmanned aircraft systems, I mean, you take the person away from the aircraft, and so you can have the journalist or reporter away from a very dangerous situation, but still able to report on that and maybe even uncover human rights abuses, such as in Syria. Many of the countries that have had recent uprisings. I'm thinking specifically of Turkey. Some citizens have actually taken it upon themselves to fly drones over the protest in Turkey, in Istanbul. That individual had his aircraft shot down, but fortunately the pilot himself was not shot. I think that's a huge takeaway and a huge advantage. And this is kind of getting into the area of kind of drones for international development too, which is also becoming kind of a hot topic as it's being realized that all this use of unmanned aircraft systems doesn't just apply to war zones. The technology is ambivalent of its use, so you can also use it for good. There's projects such as Matternet, which hopes to set up a network of unmanned aircraft to deliver small parcels in areas where road development is nearly impossible, even if there was funding to do so, on a small enough timeline. Currently, unmanned aircraft are being used to take care of watch over rhinos, where those are rare. And those are also areas where the forest on the ground is very small in comparison to the kind of threat that the rhino population is facing. So you can better allocate your rangers. You can set not necessarily dangerous but dull tasks to this unmanned aircraft, so it can go along the side of a fence and look at holes. It can track poachers, and so really we're seeing kind of a dawn of a whole new area in which these basically aerial robots can help society, and of course journalists want to be part of that. We already have journalists in war zones, and that has been increasingly dangerous for journalists to do. That doesn't mean it takes away all of the risk if you get caught with the equipment on the ground, but at least gives you some distance between things like police and army forces in a dangerous situation.
Well, unfortunately, we're going to have to stop there. That's all the time we have. But thank you very much, Matthew and Mickey, for joining me today to continue the conversation. Share your thoughts with us on Twitter @BreakThruNews. We'll be right back in a moment after this quick excerpt from the latest episode of Live Studio featuring Doug Gillard. Thank you everyone for tuning in. I'm Charlotte thun-hohenstein and this is Breakthrough News, an independent news show for the free-thinking web. We bring you a range of voices on the issues that today's generation is thinking about. Be sure to check out BreakThruRadio.com through the weekend for our continued Obsolete Week coverage, including stories about the end of motor vehicles in major metropolitan areas, whether turning your house keys into a mobile app will truly keep your possessions safe, and what's wrong with having too much information. That's it for what's breaking through the news today. Tell us what's breaking through your world on Twitter @BreakThruNews. I'm Charlotte thun-hohenstein. Thank you for joining us.
You're watching Breakthrough News.